the inspector spoke to me. If what the boy says is correct, it sounds as if the person whom you are seeking may have had a finger in the pie. I was of the same opinion, as, apparently, were Lessingham and Sidney. Atherton collared the youth by the shoulder, which Mr. Pleasman had left disengaged. What sort of looking bloke is it who's been murdered? I dunno. I haven't seen him. Mrs. Henderson, she says to me. Gustus Barley, she says, a bloke's been murdered. That there Harab what I chucked out half hour ago been and murdered him, and left him behind up in my back room. You run as hard as you can tear and tell them their drat police what's so fond of shovin' their dirty noses into respectable people's oozes. So I comes and tells yer. That's all I knows about it. We went four in the hansom which had been waiting in the street to Mrs. Henderson's in Paradise Place, the inspector and we three. Mr. Pleasman and Gustus Barley followed on foot. The inspector was explanatory. Mrs. Henderson keeps a sort of lodging house, a sailor's home she calls it, but no one could call it sweet. It doesn't bear the best of characters, and if you asked me what I thought of it, I should say in plain English that it was a disorderly house. Paradise Place proved to be within 300 or 400 yards of the station house. So far as could be seen in the dark, it consisted of a row of houses of considerable dimensions, and also of considerable antiquity. They opened on to 2 or 3 stone steps which led directly into the street. At one of the doors stood an old lady with a shawl drawn over her head. This was Mrs. Henderson. She greeted us with garrulous volubility. So you have come, have you? I thought you never was a comin' that I did. She recognized the inspector. It's you, Mr. Phillips, is it? Perceiving us, she drew a little back. Who's them air parties? They ain't coppers? Mr. Phillips dismissed her inquiry, curtly. Never you mind who they are. What's this about someone being murdered? SSH. The old lady glanced round. Don't you speak so loud, Mr. Phillips. No one don't know nothing about it as yet. The parties what's in my ooze is most respectable, most. And they couldn't abide the notion of there being police about the place. We quite believe that, Mrs. Henderson. The inspector's tone was grim. Mrs. Henderson led the way up a staircase which would have been distinctly the better for repairs. It was necessary to pick one's way as one went, and as the light was defective, stumbles were not infrequent. Our guide paused outside a door on the topmost landing. From some mysterious recess in her apparel she produced a key. It's in air. I locked the door so that nothing mightn't be disturbed. I knows how particular you pleasman is. She turned the key. We all went in, we, this time, in front, and she behind. A candle was guttering on a broken and dilapidated single washhand stand. A small iron bedstead stood by its side, the clothes on which were all tumbled and tossed. There was a rush-seated chair with a hole in the seat, and that, with the exception of 1 or 2 chipped pieces of stoneware, and a small round mirror which was hung on a nail against the wall, seemed to be all that the room contained. I could see nothing in the shape of a murdered man. Nor, it appeared, could the inspector either. What's the meaning of this, Mrs. Henderson? I don't see anything here. It's bind the bed, Mr. Phillips. I left him just where I found him. I wouldn't have touched him not for nothing, nor yet have let nobody else have touched him neither, because, as I say, I know how particular you pleasman is. We all four went hastily forward. Atherton and I went to the head of the bed. Lessingham and the inspector, leaning right across the bed, peeped over the side. There, on the floor in the space which was between the bed and the wall, lay the murdered man. At sight of him, an exclamation burst from Sidney's lips. "It's Holt!" "Thank God," cried Lessingham. "It isn't Marjorie." The relief in his tone was unmistakable. That the one was gone was plainly nothing to him in comparison with the fact that the other was left. Thrusting the bed more into the center of the room, I knelt down beside the man on the floor. A more deplorable spectacle than he presented I have seldom witnessed. He was decently clad in a grey tweed suit, white hat, collar and necktie, and it was perhaps that fact which made his extreme attenuation the more conspicuous. I doubt if there was an ounce of flesh on the whole of his body. His cheeks and the sockets of his eyes were hollow. The skin was drawn tightly over his cheekbones, the bones themselves were staring through. Even his nose was wasted, so that nothing but a ridge of cartilage remained. I put my arm beneath his shoulder and raised him from the floor. No resistance was offered by the body's gravity, he was as light as a little child. "I doubt," I said, "if this man has been murdered. It looks to me like a case of starvation, or exhaustion, possibly a combination of both." "What's that on his neck?" asked the inspector. He was kneeling at my side. He referred to 2 abrasions of the skin, one on either side of the man's neck. "They look to me like scratches. They seem pretty deep, but I don't think they're sufficient in themselves to cause death. They might be, joined to an already weakened constitution. Is there anything in his pockets? Let's lift him onto the bed." We lifted him onto the bed, a featherweight he was to lift. While the inspector was examining his pockets, to find them empty, a tall man with a big black beard came bustling in. He proved to be Dr. Glossop, the local police surgeon, who had been sent for before our quitting the station house. His first pronouncement, made as soon as he commenced his examination, was, under the circumstances, sufficiently startling. "I don't believe the man's dead. Why didn't you send for me directly you found him?" The question was put to Mrs. Henderson. "Well, Dr. Glossop, I wouldn't touch him myself, and I wouldn't have him touched by no one else, because, as I've said afore, I know a particular them policeman is." "Then in that case, if he does die you'll have had a hand in murdering him, that's all." The lady sniggered. "Of course, Dr. Glossop, we all knows that you'll always have your joke. You'll find it a joke if you have to hang, as you ought to, the doctor said what he did say to himself, under his breath." I doubt if it was flattering to Mrs. Henderson. "Have you got any brandy in the house?" "We've got everythink in the ooze for them as likes to pay for it, everythink." Then, suddenly remembering that the police were present, and that hers were not exactly licensed premises, leastways we can send out for it for them parties as gives us the money, being, as is well known, always willing to oblige. "Then send for some, to the tap downstairs, if that's the nearest. If this man dies before you've brought it I'll have you locked up as sure as you're a living woman." The arrival of the brandy was not long delayed, but the man on the bed had regained consciousness before it came. Opening his eyes he looked up at the doctor bending over him. "Hallo, my man. That's more like the time of day. How are you feeling?" The patient stared hazily up at the doctor, as if his sense of perception was not yet completely restored, as if this big bearded man was something altogether strange. Atherton bent down beside the doctor. "I'm glad to see you looking better, Mr. Holt. You know me, don't you? I've been running about after you all day long." You are, the man's eyes closed, as if the effort at recollection exhausted him. He kept them closed as he continued to speak. "I know who you are. You are the gentleman. Yes, that's it, I'm the gentleman, name of Atherton, Miss Linden's friend. And I dare say you're feeling pretty well done up, and in want of something to eat and drink. Here's some brandy for you. The doctor had some in a tumbler. He raised the patient's head, allowing it to trickle down his throat. The man swallowed it mechanically, motionless, as if unconscious what it was that he was doing. His cheeks flushed. The passing glow of color caused their condition of extraordinary, and, indeed, extravagant attenuation, to be more prominent than ever. The doctor laid him back upon the bed, feeling his pulse with one hand, while he stood and regarded him in silence. Then, turning to the inspector, he said to him in an undertone, "If you want him to make a statement, he'll have to make it now, he's going fast. You won't be able to get much out of him, he's too far gone, and I shouldn't bustle him, but get what you can." The inspector came to the front, a notebook in his hand. "I understand from this gentleman, signifying Atherton, that your name's Robert Holt. I'm an inspector of police, and I want you to tell me what has brought you into this condition. Has anyone been assaulting you?" Holt, opening his eyes, glanced up at the speaker mistily, as if he could not see him clearly, still less understand what it was that he was saying. Sidney, stooping over him, endeavored to explain. "The inspector wants to know how you got here. Has anyone been doing anything to you? Has anyone been hurting you?" The man's eyelids were partially closed. Then they opened wider and wider. His mouth opened too. On his skeleton features there came a look of panic fear. He was evidently struggling to speak. At last words came. "The Beetle." He stopped. Then, after an effort, spoke again. "The Beetle." "What's he mean?" asked the inspector. "I think I understand," Sidney answered, then turning again to the man in the bed. "Yes, I hear what you say, the Beetle. Well, has the Beetle done anything to you?" "It took me by the throat." "Is that the meaning of the marks upon your neck?" "The Beetle killed me." The lids closed. The man relapsed into a state of lethargy. The inspector was puzzled, and said so. "What's he mean about a beetle?" Atherton replied, "I think I understand what he means, and my friends do too. We'll explain afterwards. In the meantime, I think I'd better get as much out of him as I can, while there's time." "Yes," said the doctor, his hand upon the patient's pulse, "while there's time. There isn't much, only seconds." Sidney endeavored to rouse the man from his stupor. "You've been with Miss Linden all the afternoon and evening, haven't you, Mr. Holt?" Atherton had reached a chord in the man's consciousness. His lips moved, in painful articulation. "Yes, all the afternoon and evening, God help me." "I hope God will help you, my poor fellow. You've been in need of his help if ever man was. Miss Linden is disguised in your old clothes, isn't she?" "Yes, in my old clothes." "My God! And where is Miss Linden now?" The man had been speaking with his eyes closed. Now he opened them, wide. There came into them the former staring horror. He became possessed by uncontrollable agitation, half raising himself in bed. Words came from his quivering lips as if they were only drawn from him by the force of his anguish. "The Beetle's going to kill Miss Linden." A momentary paroxysm seemed to shake the very foundations of his being. His whole frame quivered. He fell back onto the bed, ominously. The doctor examined him in silence, while we two were still. This time he's gone for good, there'll be no conjuring him back again. I felt a sudden pressure on my arm, and found that Lessingham was clutching me with probably unconscious violence. The muscles of his face were twitching. He trembled. I turned to the doctor. "Doctor, if there is any of that brandy left, will you let me have it for my friend?" Lessingham disposed of the remainder of the shilling's worth. I rather fancy it saved us from a scene. The inspector was speaking to the woman of the house. "Now, Mrs. Henderson, perhaps you'll tell us what all this means. Who is this man, and how did he come in here, and who came in with him, and what do you know about it altogether? If you've got anything to say, say it, only you'd better be careful, because it's my duty to warn you that anything you do say may be used against you."